I was the guide nobody wanted to hire, and that suited me fine. 10 years running supply lines through the Kathir Deep had taught me that a man who needs a flooded causeway crossed by morning doesn't much care what you used to be, only whether you get him there dry. So when the royal steward found me relashing a rope bridge at the edge of the drowned temple road and told me the Queen of the Serai Reach required a guide through the flood country, I didn't ask why me. I asked how many were in the party and how much gear they meant to carry. 6, he said. The Queen, her court champion, 4 attendants. I told him 3 days, maybe 4 if the causeway had shifted since the last rains. He looked at my boots, my hands, the gray coming in at my temples, and didn't try to hide his disappointment. I was used to that look. I'd worn it myself, most mornings, in a mirror I didn't keep anymore. Queen Caliph Vor Serai met me at the causeway head at first light. She was tall in the way her people were tall. Skin the deep black of wet basalt, hair braided white silver and coiled twice around her crown, eyes a violet so pale they read almost as light. She did not look at me the way the steward had. She looked at me the way you look at a tool you haven't decided you need yet, assessing, not dismissing. Her champion decided for her. Dresk von Arun was broad through the shoulders, young, certain of himself the way only men who've never been tested can afford to be. He looked me over once and said, loud enough for the whole party to hear, that the Reach must be poorer than he'd thought, if this was the best guide gold could buy. The attendants laughed. Caliph did not. She also did not stop him. I said nothing. I checked the lines on the rope bridge instead, because that was the job, and got them moving. The causeway had shifted. On the second day the old stone gave way beneath the lead attendant, and the floodwater that had been sitting quiet under the temple ruins for 300 years came up all at once, black and fast and cold enough to stop a heart. There wasn't time to shout a warning that would have meant anything. I heard the stone crack before I saw it, and by the time I turned, the water was already past my knees and climbing. I didn't think about it. I got a line around the Queen before the current took her, looped it twice through my own belt, the way I'd done it 100 times on worse rivers than this one, and got my boots braced against the broken stone. The water pulled hard enough to take the breath out of me, cold enough that my hands went numb around the rope before I'd counted to 10, and I held anyway, because letting go wasn't a thing my hands had ever learned how to do. Dresk had frozen at the sound of the water, staring at the current like it was something he could argue with. It took him longer than it should have to remember how his own hands worked, but he got there in the end, and between the two of us we hauled the Queen up onto dry rock before the surge could finish what it started. Nobody thanked me. Dresk told the party it was his grip that had saved her. Caliph said nothing at all, but she watched me wring the water out of my sleeves with an attention I hadn't earned yet, and didn't look away when I noticed. We reached the sunken temple on the 4th evening. The Serai Reach, I learned then, doesn't crown its queens without ceremony, and it doesn't let them keep an escort without one either. Any man who wished to stand at the Queen's side, guide, guard, or otherwise, first stood in the right circle against her champion. It wasn't a marriage rite. It was older and plainer than that. A test of whether you were worth defending her with your life, proven the only way the old temple recognized proof. Dresk laughed when the herald read the old law aloud and looked straight at me. He said he'd break nothing that wasn't already broken, and the court laughed with him, and Caliph's face went very still and very careful, the way a person's face goes when they've stopped expecting better and are only waiting to see how bad it gets. That night I found her ceremonial staff face down in the temple mud, dropped and forgotten in the flood scramble 2 days before, half buried where nobody had thought to look. I cleaned it as best I could with river water in my own shirt tail, and when the court gathered the next morning for the rite, I didn't hand it to her steward the way protocol asked. I crossed the circle myself, knelt, and put it back into her hand, gripped first, and met her eyes while I did it. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. She looked at the staff. Then she looked at me for longer than she had all week, and for the first time I saw something behind the violet that wasn't assessment. It looked almost like a question. Dresk didn't wait for an answer. He called the rite formally, grinning at his own certainty, and the court gathered in a ring around the broken temple floor to watch a guide get taught his place. I hadn't told anyone what I did before I started running supply lines. There'd been no reason to. 10 years of dodging flood surges and rockfalls does something to a body that 10 years of parade drills doesn't. Teaches you where the ground gives, how to read a man's weight before he moves it, how to spend exactly as much force as a thing requires and not one measure more. Before the Deep, I'd spent 6 years clearing charges under fire for men who never learned my name either. I hadn't touched a blade in a long time. I hadn't forgotten how. Dresk came in fast, showing off, the way men do when they've never needed to do anything else. He was strong and quick, and under other circumstances I'd have called him dangerous. But strength spent without a plan just tells you where a man will be a half second before he gets there. I let him spend himself on the first 3 strikes, watching his footing instead of his blade, keeping my own breath slow and even, while his went ragged. And when he overreached on the 4th, I stepped inside his guard and put him on the temple stone with no more force than it took to get him there. He got up. I let him. He came again, angrier, sloppier, swinging wide enough that I could have ended it clean, and I put him down a second time instead. And this time I stayed close enough that everyone in that circle could see I'd chosen not to finish it. The court had gone quiet somewhere during the second exchange. I didn't notice when. I was only watching Dresk's hands, making sure he understood before he tried a third time that this wasn't going to go the way he'd promised the room it would. He didn't try a third time. He stayed down, breathing hard, staring up at me like he was trying to work out which part of what he'd seen was true. I stepped back and lowered my hands, and that was the end of it, as far as I was concerned. It wasn't until I turned that I saw Kalith crossing the ruined floor toward me, staff in hand, the whole court parting around her without being asked. She stopped close enough that I could see her eyes weren't pale from indifference. They'd simply never had cause to be anything else in that court, until now. "You picked my staff up out of the mud," she said, "and you didn't hand it to a servant. You held a rope through a flood you had no obligation to survive for, and you fought my champion like you'd already decided you had nothing left to prove by hurting him." She said it quietly, but the whole circle heard her anyway. The old law asks for a champion. It doesn't ask for a war god. I didn't know I'd find one carrying my bags. Someone near the back, I never learned who, said it again under their breath, and it went around the circle like a struck bell. A living war god, and none of us saw it. Kalith didn't smile the way courts expect their queens to smile. She reached out and closed her hand once over my forearm, brief and deliberate, and said the only thing that mattered to me out of everything spoken that day: "I see you now." That's the only right this reach ever needed. I told her I hadn't done any of it to be seen. She said she knew. That was, she told me, exactly why it counted. We stayed at the temple 2 more days before the causeway was safe enough to cross back. Dresk kept his distance and, to his credit, kept his mouth shut. Kalith walked beside me instead of ahead of me for the whole of the return, and somewhere on that second morning, without either of us remarking on it, she stopped calling me the guide, and started, simply, calling me Gareth. I never did tell her what I'd been before the deep. She never asked. I think by then she'd already worked out the only part of it that mattered. Not what I'd once carried, but what I'd chosen to carry for her, quietly, long before anyone thought to look.